Hello everyone. This week's Parasha is Parashat Hukat, and thankfully there are many interesting subjects and topics that can be addressed. But in this video I only want to address one particular topic, and perhaps this topic is, the topic that is most spoken about, at least in this Parasha. And of course, this is the incident where Bnei Israel are unhappy, they're thirsty, they're unhappy that they left Egypt, they're dying in the desert. Claims that we've heard many times. The basic problem that Bnei Israel is experiencing at this moment is that there's no water. There's no water. And like I said, this is not, an incident that is unlike any other before. Very often, this is a nation traveling in the desert for many years. It's not crazy to imagine that in the desert you're a nation and it's the desert, so there's not going to be a lot of water, and people need to drink water. So it's not unfathomable that this will be a common complaint. But there is something different about this story than other stories in the Chumash that are quite similar, and I'd like to discuss that. And then perhaps provide some thoughts as to why this incident is actually different than other incidents, and the outcome of what ends up happening here. So, in order to do this, I'd like to read the Pesukim. This is we're in chapter 20 of Bet Midrash, right? Pasuk Aleph just is background information, right? Telling you the date, and parenthetically also Miriam died, and they buried her there. Now Pasuk 2, Velo hayamayim la'idha v'kahalu al Moshe ve'al Aharon וירב העם עם משה ויאמרו לאמור ברוכה באנו בגבע אחינו לפני אדוני ולמה הבאתם את קהל אדוני אל המדבר הזה למות שם אנחנו ובעירנו ולמה חילצונו ממצרים להביא אותנו אל המקום הרע הזה לא מקום זרע ותנה וגפן ורמון ומים אין לשתות ויבוא משה ואהרון מפני הקהל אל פתח אוהל מועד ויפלו על פניהם וירחם עוד אדוני עליהם. Right, so these are the Pesukim. So the nation's unhappy, like we said, they're thirsty. So they complain to Moshe and Aharon, they congregate around them, and they say, like they've said many times, why did you bring us out of Egypt? To bring us down in the desert, we're thirsty. What's going on? That's Bnei Israel's complaints. That's what Bnei Israel does. But I would like to take a second to look at what Moshe and Aharon do. Right? Pasuk Vav, ויבוא משה ואהרון מפני הקהל אל פתח אוהל מועד ויפלו על פניהם. Moshe and Aharon go to the entrance of Ohel Moed and they fall on their face. Right? And there, the God conveys a message to Moshe with instructions as to how to fix this problem. Right? This is Pasuk Zayin. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור קח את המטה והקהל את העדה אתה ואהרון אחיך ודברתם אל הסלע לעיניהם ונתן מימיו והוסת עלי מים מן הסלע ושכיתה את העדה ואת בעירם ויקח משה את המטה מלפני אדוני כאשר צווהו ויקהילו משה ואהרון את הקהל אל פני הסלע ויאמר להם שמעו נא המורים מן הסלע הזה נוציא לכם מים וירא משה את ידו ויח את הסלע במעטהו פעמיים ויסעו מים רבים ותש העדה ובעירם ויאמר אדוני אל משה ואל אהרון יען לא האמנתם בי להקדישני לעיני בני ישראל לכן לא תביאו את הקהל הזה אל הארץ אשר נתתי להם. Okay, so right, then we have God's communication, what he conveys to Moshe, and then Aharon, right, he tells Moshe a solution: go, take your staff, gather the people, speak to this rock, and you'll get water from it, right? So Moshe goes and he takes the staff, but like we all know, instead of speaking to the rock, Moshe hits the rock twice. Then a lot of water comes out, and he gives the water, right? It's not food, so he doesn't feed them, but I guess he gives them the water to drink. And then after that, God speaks to Moshe and Aharon, right? And he says to them, because you didn't believe in me, to sanctify me, Israel, to or in front of Bnei Israel, therefore you, Moshe and Aharon, you will not be the ones to bring in this nation, Bnei Israel, to the land, Dehainu, Eretz Israel. Now, what was Moshe and Aharon's transgression or what have you? What does it mean when God said, what was it exactly that Moshe and Aharon did? And this, many people, many mefarshim and contemporary individuals, this is something that many people speak about. But I'd like to suggest something, maybe it's been said before, but something I thought of when Ohad asked me to make a video. Okay, so we see a very, very similar event, and I like to discuss that for a second. And by contrasting these two events, I think we might get a possibility as to what is it that Moshe did and Moshe and Aharon did, which resulted in their being barred from entering Bnei Israel, or rather being the leaders who bring Bnei Israel into the land. So the similar event that everyone speaks about when reading this story is in Sefer Shemot, Parashat Beshalach, right? Everyone's familiar that these two stories are very similar, and I like to take a quick look at it so we can discuss something that seems to be similar, but what it is that's different. Okay, this is chapter 17, right? It's chapter 17 in Sefer Shemot. Okay. ויסעו כל עדת בני ישראל מתברסים למעשיהם על פי אדוני ויחנו ברפידים ואין מים לשתות העם וירב העם עם משה ויאמרו תנו לנו מים ונשתה ויאמר להם משה מה תריבון עמדי מה תנסון את אדוני וישמע שם העם למים וילן העם על משה ויאמר למה זה העליתנו ממצרים להמיס אותי ואת בני ואת מקני ושמה ויזעק משה לאדוני לאמור מה אעשה לעם הזה עוד מעט ותקלוני ויאמר אדוני אל משה עבור לפני העם וקח אתך בזקני ישראל ומתך אשר הכית בו את האור קח בידך והלכת הנני עומד לפניך שם על הסור בחורב והכית בסור ויעשהו ממנו מים ושתה העם ויעש כמשה לעיני זקני ישראל. Okay, so what happens in this story, right? Again, very similar. The nation is thirsty, and they complain to Moshe, why did you bring me out of Egypt? So on and so forth. But the one pasuk, one part of the story that stands out, at least to me, is Moshe's response. What does Moshe do in the story in Beshalach? Pasuk Dalet, Vayis'ak Moshe l'Adonai lemor, Ma yaseh la'am hazeh, od ma'at uskaluni. Moshe initiates conversation with God. Ask him, what am I supposed to do? he says, okay, they're about to stone me, right? But Moshe seeks an answer. He seeks a solution. He starts a conversation with God, who is Moshe's support system, so to speak, and he asks God, what am I supposed to do? Whereas in Parashat Hukat, the response for Moshe and Aharon is quite different. Moshe does not yell out to God, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Moshe and Aharon, and that's why it is Aharon who is involved in the punishment of not being the one to bring in, to bring the nation in, is they fall on their faces. They're in shock, right? We can understand why they're in shock. How many times is a leader going to hear the same story of the nation? Why did you bring me out of Egypt? We're going to die here. We're thirsty. We're hungry. So on and so forth. And how many times is it going to be a complaint as opposed to effective communication? Bnei Israel could have just asked Moshe, please, thirsty, give us some water. I can understand Moshe and Aharon's frustration. Yet what we see in Parashat Hukat, which is quite different than Beshalach, is instead of turning to God like is that a Beshalach, they just fall on their faces. They're distraught. They don't see any point in turning to God and asking God for help. Instead, it's almost like they lose it and they're just given up. And I think that's what it means when God says, Yana shel lo ha'emantem bi la'akdisheni la'enei bnei Israel. Moshe and Aharon, you just fall on your face. You didn't talk to me. You didn't believe. You didn't have emunah in me. I'm speaking for God, kivyachol, right? You didn't have emunah in me that we could discuss this problem and we can figure it out. Instead, you just fall on your face. Whereas in Beshalach, right, Moshe is frustrated. We could see that. But he says, what am I supposed to do? He reaches out to God. He has emunah in God. And thus he reaches out to God. And that's why in Parashat Beshalach, God's response is simply, here's what to do. Parashat Hukat, it's, okay, Moshe and Aharon, you had your slot, but you're not going to be the ones to bring this out into the nation. And I think there's something in Parashat Debarim that further indicates that this perhaps is what is happening. Because in Parashat Debarim, when Moshe is telling Bnei Israel the story of the Meragelim, what happened? Moshe says something quite intriguing, but nonetheless, the whole story isn't what we shall address. Just the one line that is relevant to our discussion. This is chapter 1 of Debarim, right? This is chapter 1 in Debarim, pasuk 37. Gam bi hit'anaf Adonai bichlachem lemor, gam ata lo tavo sham. Right? So in Debarim, presumably Moshe is saying, as a result of what you guys did by Het HaMeragelim, was the reason why God said, I cannot enter the land of Israel. Now, obviously, there's a question nonetheless. Why is he connecting it to Parashat Shelach Lecha when we see this is happening with the story with the water? But if we turn to Parashat Shelach Lecha for a second, I think there is an answer that, I know there's an answer that I would like to suggest. After the Meragelim return, they returned back, they went to scout out the land, Atura Ta'ares, and they come back. We see an incident quite similar to what we see in Parashat Hukat. This is chapter 14 of Sefer Bet Midrash, right? Pasuk Dalto. Vayomeru ish el achiv nitin harosh v'nashu b'Mitzrayim. Right? Like we saw in Hukat. Why'd you take us out? The same complaint again. Okay, let's cut our losses, go back to Egypt. And what is the response of Moshe and Aharon? ויפול משה ואהרון על פניהם לפני כל קהל עדת בני ישראל. Right? וישוע בן נון וכלב בן יפונה מן אתרים והארץ קרעו בכדיהם ויאמרו אל כל עדת בני ישראל לאמור הארץ אשר עברנו בה לתורתה טובה הארץ מאוד מאוד. Okay, so what happens in Shelach Lecha? The spies come back from Israel with all their negative reports, and the whole nation hears everything that they're saying, and the whole nation's response is, okay, let's go back to Egypt. This Israel thing not happening. Again, nation saying something, immature, perhaps even in impulsive nature. But instead of looking at what the nation says, I'd like to focus once more on Moshe and Aharon's response, or lack thereof. Vayipol Moshe ve'Aharon al penehem. Right? Moshe and Aharon again fall on their faces. They're devastated, they're distraught, they're in shock, but there's no response. And in fact, the Pasuk tells us, I can't help but think that these words that the Torah is informing us on is trying to set the stage for us. Moshe and Aharon are the leaders, and in front of the whole nation, they're crying. As opposed to Caleb ben Yefuneh and Yoshua ben Nun, who are who in the situation of the Meragelim, they're the ones who take action. They rip their clothes and they speak up. They say that the land is good. They say we can do it. Right? Again, the word mered, interesting, right? That we have the word Shimuna Hamorim. Right? Anyway, the point I'm trying to portray here, the point I'm trying to convey here, rather, is that the transgression or the failure in Moshe and Aharon's leadership that perhaps caused God to say, you two, you're not the ones that are going to lead Bnei Israel into Eretz Israel, I think is in their later years in Sefer Bet Midrash, as opposed to in Sefer Shemot, is again the depiction of Moshe and Aharon falling on their faces. Vayipol Moshe ve'Aharon al penehem, again and again. There's no action. There's no sign of leadership. So much so that in Parashat Shelach Necha, two other individuals, namely Caleb ben Yefuneh and Joshua ben Nun, need to take the shoes, fill the shoes of Moshe and Aharon and be the leaders, because no one else in this narrative is acting like a leader. So in conclusion, it's been a while. In conclusion, it seems that in our Parasha, the sin or the wrongdoing of Moshe and Aharon wasn't necessarily the hitting of the rock or any other suggestion, but I think it was the lack of faith, patience. Harambam speaks, they lost their temper. And perhaps that plays into what I'm describing here. Instead of reaching out to God and saying, I have a problem, what shall we do? Instead of in Shelach Necha, saying to the nation, like Caleb ben Yefuneh and Yoshua ben Nun do, instead, they lose their temper, they lose their patience, and perhaps they even lose their faith in God and lose their hope in God and lose their hope in the nation and give up. And when a leader is not willing to have faith in God nor his nation nor the nation that the leader is supposed to be leading, they cannot be the ones that are going to continue leading this nation. So perhaps it's not the most inspiring message, but I think it may be enlightening as to what was the sin of Moshe and Aharon, and maybe something more inspiring, lesson about our own leadership, right? We can never just be passive. Not only can we not be passive, we cannot fall on our face when we see something that we don't like. We have to reach out to God. We have to reach out to our contemporaries, the people that we are supposed to be interacting with. Try to reach solutions. Try to communicate to get to where we want to be, instead of just falling on our faces and ultimately ending up being leaders who are unsuccessful and need to be replaced. Shabbat Shalom.